Great. So I'm Jeff Greenfield. I'm an osteopath. I do osteopathic hands-on cranial osteopathy, manual therapy, and I got into complex chronic disease when I worked in New Hampshire, and the Lyme epidemic started scourging New Hampshire in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the people I was treating would come in with bizarre symptoms, and what I felt under my hands changed. So what I would do is try to learn what was going on under my hands and then learn how to treat them and see if what I was doing was right by how their body responded. So I still do that today. So I couple the osteopathy with the chronic illness. From New Hampshire, I was invited to go work at Gordon Medical Center out in California, which was at least in the past was one of the top Lyme chronic illness places, I thought, in the country and the world. It lasted 18 months in California and then rubber banded as far as we could away from California to Maine. And so started working with these guys and haven't looked back. It's been great. Still doing chronic disease, trying to be about 50-50 osteopathy and 50% chronic disease, but always osteopathy. And because we have limited space, we wanted to put on something like this to get other people involved in treating this. And then we'll talk more about that. This is for that.
So I've been in practice for about 21 years now, and I've known Jeff for a long time. We're in an osteopathic study group together, and when I was starting to learn this, I would call him up, and he'd be commuting from his house in northern New Hampshire down. He had like an hour-long commute, so I had a chance to grab him and ask questions, and so he's been a great resource in terms of providing with information, especially with regards to the mold. I started out working a lot with autistic kids and kind of working with the biomedical model, and then that kind of led me into looking at seeing it, kids with PANS and kids showing up with Lyme disease, and I tried to hold off on treating it for the longest time, and then now here I am, so doing all of it.
Yes, we're reluctant Lyme doctors, right? I think a lot of people are. I mean, it's hard to. So we're going to give you our slant on mycotoxin illness. There's a lot that's in here that we're going to skip over, but for other reasons, time basically, because this is like a 3 to 5 hour lecture that's condensed quite a bit. But hopefully when you leave here you'll have an idea of what we do. We talked about making the slides available to people, particularly the ones that have treatment protocols. Probably if we don't have doses in, we'll fill in doses and put it in a PDF, and if people want to give emails here, we can send it out. Again, it's not a territorial thing. We want everybody here to want to treat this. Hopefully that's the goal. So I wanted to talk about mycotoxin illness, diagnosis, evaluation, and treatment. There, now it's working. And neither of us have a conflict of interest other than we treat this. If you want to learn a little bit about this, my mentor in this was Neil Nathan, who wrote the book Toxic. I've known Neil for about 35 years. At Gordon Medical, I worked with Neil. In the mid-2000s, Neil presented a course called Shoemaker Made Ridiculously Simple. And Keelan and I took that a couple of times, and he was able to take Shoemaker's work and make it understandable. Richie, if you've ever heard Richie talk, when you first start listening to him, you can understand maybe 1 out of 10 words. When you start listening a little bit more and know him better, maybe 1 out of 4, and 1 out of 3. I think I'm down to 1 out of 4, because he's really smart, and but this is a well-written book. It talks about mold, a little bit about Bartonella, and what you can do about it. I recommend it to my patients all the time, and they love it. Some of them say it's the best book about chronic illness they ever read because it gives them hope. We all know that patients are much more complex these days. It's not as easy as when I started, and it's getting harder and harder. There's mycotoxins and biotoxins and tick-borne disease, and mast cell activation syndrome and dietary issues and stress and toxic environments and on and on and on. You can read that, but we see all that. But I want to focus more on mold toxins and mycotoxins. And these are biologically active molecules. They have this unique property of being able to dissolve in water and fat. Okay? They also are these things called ionophores. So sometimes when they dissolve in fat, they can create ion channels that can let things enter into cells and let things enter into mitochondria. So they can disrupt things in lots of ways. People with mycotoxin illness have multiple symptoms. Mycotoxins can mimic or worsen chronic complex illness. They're immune suppressive, and we'll get to one that's actually a patented drug for immune suppression. And they can impair our ability to get better when we have other things. And when I see a fair amount of people with Tick-Borne disease who have been treated better than I would treat them, and they still have it. Very often, this is what they had underlying, and they couldn't mount an immune response to treat it. So mold toxin is to mold, kind of like car exhaust is to a car. So mold toxin is not mold. When people say, I'm sick from mold, you can get an allergy to mold, but if you get the toxins, it's more like you're okay if you're exposed to mold toxin and car exhaust outside because it diffuses in the atmosphere. But if you put that car in a garage or an enclosed space, just like if you put mold toxin in an enclosed space, you can actually get sick because it has nowhere to diffuse. So I actually use this analogy for my patients because they don't understand, well, why don't I get sick outside? Well, you don't get sick from cars outside. You may not like the smell, but if you put that car in your garage, or if you pulled a Honda generator in your basement and it exhausted in your basement, you may not make it to the next day. So the whole idea of biotoxins and mold being a problem started with this book that was written by Richie Shoemaker. And I think the copyright was 2005. Oh good, I have it up there so I can remember. And Richie was a general practitioner because he wanted to work with the people who practiced in Maryland, in the Chesapeake. And there was a Pfiesteria outbreak, and Pfiesteria is this organism that kills fish, and it releases biotoxins. But in this whole Pfiesteria outbreak, the government of the feds and the government of Maryland and Virginia said, it's not toxic to humans, nobody gets sick. And of course, what was happening to Richie is his patients were coming in complaining of all kinds of bizarre symptoms. And he talks in this book about one patient who had diarrhea illness, profuse diarrhea illness, resistant to everything he tried. Also had brain fog, weird neurological things that didn't show up in any book. And he took out the big guns because we used to use cholestyramine back then for cholesterol. And the biggest problem about cholestyramine in the 90s was it would bind you up really bad, and you may lower your cholesterol, but you won't poop. So he used cholestyramine for this patient to dry up her diarrhea. Diarrhea was better in just a week or two, and still was her neurological symptoms. And he's like, huh. So he started using cholestyramine on some of the other neurologically afflicted patients. And he was curious. So he did some research with other people at University of Maryland and others, and he found that biotoxins are these toxins that can dissolve both in water and fat, are produced by algae, spirochetes, diflagellates, recluse spiders, brown recluse spiders, special types of mold, which we'll later call toxic molds, and others. And then toxic molds, we'll talk about toxic molds, they can thrive inside our homes. They can be in our schools, and it's not limited to black mold. We all see black mold, but that's not the only toxic mold. There's many species of mold that don't cause toxins for human, that are harmful to humans, and that's okay. When people ask, well, what's a mold toxin? Another example I have is penicillin is a mold toxin, and it's a good one we use, but it's made by one of the molds that can produce bad toxins too, penicillium. But so to differentiate, you're not eating mold when you take penicillin, you're eating a chemical. So Richie goes on to talk about how he worked with Ken Huddle, a neurotoxicologist who had this machine that could or had this card where people would have to look at different shades of gray, and he found that if people had neurotoxicity, they couldn't distinguish the shades of gray, and they found out that if people were neurotoxic, they couldn't do this VCS machine. So, I mean, I don't know if we'll have time, but I brought mine in, and I brought the card, but it's about this size, and you kind of put it there, and the card you put there, and you read one eye at a time, and you can see if you see different shades of gray. If you're neurotoxic, as you get further down the line, you can't see things, and as you get better, you can see them.
Can I ask one?
Sure.
VCS test, computer versus the real deal.
The real deal is way better. Yeah. You know, you ever do it on the computer?
Yes.
Well, oh, okay. You haven't done yours on the computer.
Only on
Oh, but you can look at this one, you know, because I brought it, and it's just, you know, it really depends on your pixels, your screen. I mean, it gives you can get a pattern. So if you drop off on the last two, you can get the pattern, but it's still.
specifically, do you feel like more false positives?
I don't know. I think, you know, they talked about it in our discussion groups, didn't they? And they thought there was a lot of false positives in the computer, and even false negatives. It just depends on your computer. And then you probably see it. And some people, we won't get into it much, but some of our patients with mold toxicity can't go on a computer and feel good. They get headaches. And what does that do to this test? I will say that I don't use this as much anymore. Okay, I used it today because somebody had a equivocal mold test, but she flunked it big time, or passed it, whatever you want to do it. So, but she couldn't even do the test right. So we'll talk about that. So Richie also came up with this thing called the biotoxin pathway, and with all these PhDs he was working with. And basically, the biotoxin pathway shows how mycotoxins and biotoxins can come in and screw up the whole works. I mean, we actually memorized this at one time, but it creates cytokines, it reduces MSH, it affects hormones, and it affects sleep, it affects the gut. But we won't go through this. It's available online. You can Google it, and you can look at it. Also creates leptin resistance. You know, we see a lot of mycotoxin afflicted patients who keep gaining weight and can't lose it as long as they're in a moldy environment or still have mold toxin. So Dr. Shoemaker came up with a really, really good mechanism to look at biotoxins and mycotoxins. He was the founder of this. And we'll see later that he complained that we're unable to find biotoxins. We can't diagnose them, so we have to look at markers that are inflammatory, that the biotoxins might be causing and the mold toxin might be causing. And if you take somebody out of the moldy environment and you treat them and you get those markers down and you put them back in the moldy environment, they go up. And you take them out, you treat them again, you clean up the moldy environment, you put them back and they stay down. That's how he proved it was from mold. But along comes Joseph Brewer in about 2012, 2013, and Dr. Brewer is an infectious disease doctor. Actually, Dr. Brewer did a lot of work with transfer factor in the early 90s. He was one of the pioneers. So he's actually, as Neil would say, not chopped liver. He's actually a really smart guy. He came up with a an article that he published on open access about being able to test for mycotoxin in the urine and being able to treat that. We might, but I'll go through it a little bit now. What he did is he found about a little over 100 of his chronic fatigue patients who weren't better, and he actually found out that all these people were living in clean homes and had clean workplaces. And he did a real-time lab urinary mycotoxin test on them, and we'll talk about real-time lab in a little bit. And about 94% of these chronic fatigue patients had positive mycotoxins in the real-time lab test. So he started there. So then what he did is not only did he treat with binders like Shoemaker did, but he borrowed from the ENT literature and he gave them things to maybe kill colonization. As an ID doctor, he assumed colonization. And he got 94% of these people better. And he has follow-up papers about that too. So I will say that there's this war going on up top between Shoemaker and Brewer saying, no, you can't test mold toxins in the urine. Yes, you can, but clinically, in my opinion, it works, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is Neil Nathan, and Neil Nathan and I are hiking out in his neck of the woods in California, just kind of like looking at nature. So mold health effects versus mycotoxin illness. So for mold, you can be allergic to mold. Mold can actually stimulate your body to release histamines and mast cells. It can activate mast cells. Mold can cause infections, and mold can also create toxins that make you sick. So there's a bunch of ways you can get sick from mold and mold products. And some molds make things that are toxic to us. Some molds we're allergic to, and they don't have to be toxic molds. So you could be allergic to a mold that doesn't produce a biotoxin. But allergy is a little bit different, and we're not going to go there today. So all molds aren't toxic, but these molds are, and the big ones, Stachybotrys, Penicillium, Aspergillus, Chaetonium, and Wallemia. And then I put these others on there because they're starting to show up. These are starting to show up as having toxins, and we're treating them. Okay, but they weren't in the original talk. So this is, I don't expect you to read this, but this is from Great Plains Lab, and this is just the 40 species of mold and mycotoxins they produce. So these are 40 species of mold that can produce toxins. And this is Real-Time Lab, another lab that does it, that says what the mold toxins, what they do, the ones they test for. So what does mold toxin do to us? What symptoms does it cause? There's 3 of these slides, by the way, or maybe 2. Fatigue, weakness, muscle aches, muscle cramps, unusual pain, headache, sensitivity to light, tearing, blurred vision, chronic sinus congestion, not always though, cough, chest pain, shortness of breath can mimic babesia in some of those ways, abdominal pain, IBS, secretory diarrhea, cognitive impairment, all the things that tick-borne disease can do, it can do as well, and sometimes better. And when with tick-borne disease, watch out. Numbness and tingling in non-anatomical distribution, vertigo. When I first started treating tick-borne disease, my first 10 cases of Lyme disease were people with vertigo that was unremitting. And so vertigo is also a tick-borne disease sign, but it can be mycotoxin illness. Metallic taste or strange taste in the mouth. Thirst. In children, bedwetting over the age where they shouldn't be bedwetting. increased static shocks. Richie Shoemaker worked out this thing where the people who actually go and touch things and always get shocked in the winter, it's an ADH thing and a change in our electrolytes. He was really proud of that. Impotence, hormonal problems. It affects hormones directly. Nausea, vomiting, skin sensitivity. Sensitivity to light touch. That's actually an unusual symptoms. Itching is not on here, but itching I've seen. Anxiety is a big clue for me. Appetite swings, sweats, temperature regulation, and seizures. Actually, I've seen children with seizures that have the full workup and they can't find what caused them until we find the black mold behind the drywall. Good, it was only 2 slides. I condensed it.
So another important one is insomnia.
Yeah.
Very common.
Yeah, sleep disturbance, and actually sometimes reverse sleep patterns. So, how do we diagnose it? So, history, symptoms, VCS, Shoemaker lab, provoked urine tests for mycotoxins, nasal wash if you still suspect it and you don't get it, an oat test, and some people will use something called a neuroquant. Neuroquant we won't quite get into, but I'll just mention a little bit of it now. So, actually, why don't you do it? You've done more than I have. Why don't you talk? Well,
yeah, so I mean, I've ordered a few neuroquants, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but basically you can see atrophy in certain areas on a neuroquant. You're basically measuring volume of certain areas. So you have to send people out of the state. I had to send people down to Massachusetts
So
to
this
get
is the MR.
you said MRI.
with a neuroquant reading.
Yeah. So, yeah, so what happens is, Shoemaker believed that certain parts of the brain shrink with mold toxin and other parts of the brain shrink with Lyme disease. It doesn't turn out to be that way. However, what happens is these people with cognitive impairment, some of them will have shrinkage, which is from inflammation, and some of them will have hypertrophy, which is likely from concussion injury, and you can make a differentiation. I tend not to do them because I don't want to tell my patients, you're screwed, your brain shrunk. And so, because I just go, anyway. But a lot of our colleagues do them, and so we get to look at them. So in the history, and this is me, I actually, in a complicated patient, I like to make my own version of a timeline. You know, I'm IFM certified, and we learned a sideways timeline, but I like to go up and down so I can write. And I just do it differently. I just have my own style. But you know, this is a patient who is above 40 and their timeline. So we can see they lived in a moldy dorm, had a tick bite, had a roof leak, and I put their symptoms there. Everybody has their own way, but if I forget who the person is, I go to the timeline page and I say, "Ha! I know who you are." So, but it really helps because people will come in with these, they don't come in and say, "I'm mold toxic." They come in and say, I have all these things, you know. And of course, this person has this and this. And where do you start? Measuring visual contrast sensitivity. I used to do this a lot. I'm not sure it helps me now with the lab. It helps me if the lab that I get is unhelpful. Shoemaker, before we could do lab, would follow people this way, but then he had all these caveats that came out later in personal communications with Neil, actually, whereas if you're an artist, you can fool the test because you see contrast really well, and so that would be negative. And then some people they just can't do it anyway because of the way their glasses are. But you do the test with glasses with your best correction. So, but I did it today, and it helped. And this is what you get a worksheet with it. So This top row is really easy. This bottom row is really hard. So this top row is going to be the first column when we go to the next one. So that top row is this first column. So we can see that this person was able to get up to here, and then on the third one was starting to fall off, and definitely fell off the curve on the fourth and fifth. And in this test, if D and E drop with respect to A and B, it's a positive test. And Shoemaker's come up with a qualification of how much you drop if it's positive. I just eyeball it, you know. That's a drop. That's positive. And if either eye does it, if one eye is really good and the other eye drops off, it's a positive test. So Dr. Shoemaker came up, when he saw all these people who were sick and they were inflamed and they had normal CRPs, and he went and studied and he looked at the biotoxin pathway and he started to work these things out, he actually started investigating other inflammatory chemicals that are in the blood that we can do by blood tests that are positive when the body is fighting something. And initially he thought these were all specific for mold, but it looks like there's crossover with tick-borne disease. So, but when somebody is inflamed with having the wrong values of these or the right values of these, he came up with something called the chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. And it was going really good because this is actually a real entity until there were some legal cases where whoever was against him had really good lawyers, and if you use CIRS in a legal case, you might not get anywhere. So there are some people, I mean, you have to be really good to do it, and I don't like to do any legal cases. He also found this thing called MARCoNS. So MARCoNS is multiple antibiotic resistant coag negative staph. And MRSA is a form of MARCoNS. And what he came up with is, if you're colonized with this stuff in your nose, you're producing cytokines right near your brain, and this is causing problems. And so he would treat people with something called Beg spray for about 3 or 4 months after he found MARCoNS, and say they're okay. There's controversy right now as whether, first, MARCoNS has become resistant to almost everything we treat it with, and now there's controversy as to whether it is just a colonizer, and once we get the immune system working better, we don't have to treat it at all. I've stopped treating it unless I get a purulent, if somebody comes in with a purulent nasal discharge. You about the same way with that? But I don't want to say don't treat it, because if you're getting success, this is my experience, and my experience is I don't do these anymore, but there's a lot of people that get a lot of information out of them, and they like to do them, and they know how to manage them. I did that for years before Brewer's article, and I think I get better results now. But was there a question, Jeff?
So the microbiology DX culture, you can do fungal culture too. I mean, if that pops up, is that worth treating, or is it the same?
Well, fungal culture, so and that's actually a really good question. So there are people that do fungal cultures because some of these tests used to be really expensive for urinary mycotoxins. The problem is, if you get a positive fungal culture, you know they're colonized. Good. If you get a negative one, you don't know they're not colonized. And so people would do fungal cultures and they would get negative, say you don't have mold. No, that's wrong. Or you could do a nasal wash, and if you don't get anything, it still doesn't mean you don't have mold because you don't get all the sinuses. And it could be in your gut too.
A quick question on the slide as well, please. Some of these markers, I know Shoemaker talks about specific labs are needed, like LabCorp versus Quest. Did you clinically see that need to be the case?
Well, it used to be the case. The thing right now is all of this is changing, because Even the labs you used to send them to have changed their methodology. Some of these labs need to be spun down. Some of the samples need to be spun down in a refrigerated centrifuge, C4A, right? C4A.
Yeah.
And TGF beta, they have to do that with the.
I don't know about TGF beta.
You know, but and so labs are not doing that anymore, and you're getting faulty results. So there are people who still do these labs, and they actually, Sonia's one of them, and she actually has the centrifuge in her office, and she does it right there. The things that need to be frozen get frozen right away. Things that need to be refrigerated get refrigerated right away. So there's this big conundrum, and we're in Maine, in LabCorp and Quest, right? LabCorp and Quest? Well, LabCorp's in Portsmouth, and Quest, if you can talk one of the labs to send it to Quest, you're lucky, right? Intermed sends to Quest. And I think, does Martin's Point send to Quest? They might. But anyway, but yes, and you try. But ARUPS now does things. National Jewish does them. So things have changed over the years. But it's getting the sample there. When he talks about MCAS, you'll see that the trail of getting a blood sample to the right lab is horrendous. You just, you know. Okay. So, question, is there a better way? I have that at the very bottom. And I don't know, people do really well with this when they're really good at it, okay? So again, this is Brewer's paper, Detection of Mycotoxins in Patients with Chronic Fatigue. This is his original paper. It's open access. He found that patients who are no longer exposed had symptoms 20 to 30 years later, some of them. He borrowed treatment from ENT literature, and he borrowed binder protocols from the Department of Defense. So mycotoxins can be used as chemical weapons or bioweapons. I don't know what you would call it if it comes from a biological source. So the DoD actually has studied what is the best antidote for each of these. So the recommendations that I'll show you that I use come from Brewer's research of the DoD. So the binders that we'll show you are the ones that he recommended and I still use. It doesn't mean that other binders don't work. It means that the literature's not there. But it's all about whether your patient gets better, and it's all individual. So his initial series was with over 90% testing positive and over 90% got benefit. Not exposed to mold, and they had mycotoxin in their urine. So in Brewer's model, we want to measure the mycotoxins in the urine, or initially when real-time lab was the only one and you got a negative, real-time lab, I don't think Great Plains does nasal washings yet. You can do nasal washings with real-time lab and send them the washings, and they'll look for the mycotoxins in there. And I've done that quite a few times when people are negative. You've got to check the environment for mold if they have a positive test or if you suspect it. And you have to use appropriate binders for the patient. And then after the binders, you want to use nasal sprays and oral treatments to remove colonized mold. So how do we do this mold toxin test, this mycotoxin test? When we first started doing this test, we would have somebody take a sauna, and there was a lot of people we suspected mycotoxin, and they were negative. And then we said, well, let's give them glutathione. So we did glutathione, and we got a few more positives, but we still suspected it. I said, well, let's do glutathione and then give them challenge test that ends in a sauna, and it's a provocation test to release mycotoxin into the bloodstream, so it goes through the kidneys and into the bladder. I generally use Research Nutritional Tri-Fortify liposomal glutathione, which is 450 milligrams per packet or per teaspoon. Keelan uses a different glutathione often, but you'll sometimes use this. Packets are really easy. You give them 14 packets. But if they're sensitive to flavoring, you might have to use something else. They're on that for 7 days. At the end of 7 days, they go into a hot sauna, preferably infrared, but it doesn't have to be. I just had a call from a patient yesterday who went to go to her sauna, and the sauna was closed because they were refurbishing it, and she's like, oh, what do I do? So we had her take a really hot bath, and that works too. We like to collect urine about an hour after the sauna, so 7 days of twice a day glutathione, last day sauna. Don't pee for that full 45 minutes to an hour. Some people like get out of the sauna and pee and then give me the hour sample. That doesn't work. So they have to hold, I usually explain to them that they don't drink water till about 10 minutes before they have to collect their urine. There's a phenomenon where people with mold toxin illness can be super sensitive. They can be our most sensitive patients. They can be sensitive to people even be near them or touch. And you give them glutathione, after 2 days they might be like not able to get out of bed. If they have symptoms like that, they're done the test, they're provoked enough, they do a heat challenge of sorts, whether it's a sauna or a hot shower or a hot bath, and we collect the urine. We found Dr. Nathan and others have done studies looking at whether binders and repeat tests whether binders affect the results of a test. And it looks like if you take binders within 3 days of collecting your urine, you'll have lower mycotoxin tests. So it's recommended no binders for 3 days prior to the test. Or if you have a really sensitive patient, you might want to have them stop the binders before they start the glutathione in case they have to stop early. We use real-time lab or GPL mycotox test. Real-time labs covered by insurance. Medicare, actually, not insurance, but Medicare insurance. We'll go a little bit into the differences of them. Vibrant Health has come out with a mycotoxin test, or Vibrant America, and at least on the chat rooms that I'm on, people are not as impressed with it as they are. And then there's a company in Mexico that just came out with another test. I don't know anything about them, but other people, and Genova is talking about it. So people are getting into the business. So maybe it'll be easier to diagnose, or maybe we'll all have to hide. So I'm just going to tell a little bit about the difference between the tests, go a little bit into the real-time test, I think, and then Keelan's going to talk about the GPL test, because I do more real-time, he does more GPL. So Real-Time Lab was the first lab that came out with a mycotoxin test, and they do an enzyme-linked assay which finds the mycotoxin and some of its metabolites, okay? But there are some false positives, and of course there's false negatives too. And so there are problems with the test, but it's a good test. It was the only test we had for a while. The Great Plains test does mass spec. Mass spec, when you do a mass spec for mycotoxin, it only sees one molecule. The molecule it's looking for is the only thing it sees. So it doesn't look at metabolites, it doesn't look at things close, and there generally aren't any false positives. But there's probably some false negatives if you have a little smooth metabolite. So the people who are pro Great Plains say there's no false positives. The people that are in favor of real-time say, well, it picks up metabolites. I like real-time because I'm familiar with it, and I base my mycotoxin treatment off of the way it's ordered. But in general, if you do a real-time test and you do a GPL test, they're looking at different things. You get different patterns. So they're not looking at the same thing, so they can be synergistic. So this is my provoked mycotoxin test, which wasn't that positive, but But on this, you can see that I have ochratoxin A on the GPL test of 11.78. And here I have a not present ochratoxin A, doesn't meet their threshold. This one just barely meets their threshold. I have no gliotoxin on the GPL test, and I'm equivocal for gliotoxin on the real-time test. So if your patient can afford it, it's probably worth getting both tests. I will say that the list price for the GPL test and why people are doing more GPL is $299, and the list price for the real-time test is $699. My patients get their first, it's $699, and follow-up tests are $350, so they have a different model. My patients get it for $399 for their first test, and I wanted, if people are interested and you want to do this, I wanted to talk to Real-Time Lab and tell them that I lectured to see if you guys are interested and if you want to get your patients that discount, that it's also afforded to your patients too. And if they didn't give me that discount, I basically told them I was going to go with GPL, and I've been, and I told them, I said, that's why everybody's going with GPL, they can't afford you. I said, well, we lowered it in Maine. Well, it still says $699. Anyway, I actually...
And special $400 for a little while, a few months. We thought they were going to stick with it, but they didn't.
Yeah, it was $399, yeah. Yeah, but what happens is if you have a sick patient, I mean, even if you charge it $699, if you look after like 4 tests, the price is equal, and then real time becomes cheaper. But if it's Medicare, it's no brainer, except unless you don't get Medicare covered by your prescription, and then it's a brainer. So like you guys, you might have to have the primary right for it, yeah. If you have somebody in your office, don't you still have somebody in your office who can write for those things? Yeah. My daughter works with 2 naturopaths in Portsmouth, and she writes for a lot of their tests for Medicare. Sometimes she feels like she's being used, but she is. That's mine, but I'll let you do this because I was going to do a little bit more on mine.
How many of you utilize So Jeff and I are very similar in how we approach mold diagnosis and treatment, but a few areas we vary. One is I use the organic acid test a lot, and it probably goes back to when I was treating a lot of autism. It's a really useful test, and it's a urine test. The other areas we vary is I would probably use slightly different binders, and I use Great Plain Labs a little bit more, but otherwise we're very similar in our approach. So I wanted to go over the organic acid test because I think it's a really helpful test. Actually, where's the...
You're going the wrong.
Oh, okay.
The bottom button.
The bottom button. So it's...
One more.
There we go.
That's it.
So unfortunately, it's going to be hard to see. There's no way to make this bigger, is there? So the first... Can you do it? Can you enlarge it just a little bit?
I think.
So the first 9 markers on the organic acid test, I'll wait till he gets this up, are yeast metabolites. And I find this really...
You want just a yellow bigger?
Yeah.
You don't mind if it's off the screen, right?
No.
It's slow. Uh-oh.
You got your... there we go.
That help? It moved it.
Yeah, it moved the yellow markers. That's okay. So, so the first 9 markers are markers for intestinal yeast, but there are a few mold markers. These are, so number 2 and number 4 and number 9. So number 2 and number 4, in this particular patient, this patient had mold exposure, and this is Aspergillus species, number 2 and 4. So you can see they're elevated. And then number 9, the tricarbolic is a fusarium. So Jeff mentioned fusarium as a newer mold toxin. That's a little bit elevated, but not out of the range. And then the rest of them, arabinosis is, of course, a very common marker for candida. And I frequently find that these patients are dealing with yeast issues too, so it's kind of nice to have that information. I find this test markers very sensitive. I don't think you can get false positives. They recommend that you eliminate 4 fruits that have arabinose before you do the urine test. That's apples, pears, cranberries, and grapes. So I think it's pretty sensitive. So going down to number 10, under bacterial markers, you see hippuric, and that marker can be elevated when there's liver stress. So this tells me this patient, most of these patients that are dealing with mycotoxin illness, liver support in some way, but that's kind of validation that there's some liver stress. And then is there a way to easily scroll down, Jeff, or how do we?
No, because I changed.
All right, so I'll just move to the next. There's actually nothing else I wanted to show you on that bottom, except there's some other bacterial markers. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction again. All right, unfortunately, you can't see this too well. The first, so glycolic and glyceric acid are genetic markers for oxalate production. So if you see either one of those elevated, then genetically they're predisposed to making more oxalates. And why are oxalates important? In kids, when they're elevated, it can be due to yeast, it can be due to mold, and it can cause, they actually form as little oxalate crystals, and they can experience bladder issues, enuresis, pain. I can actually have joint pain if there's enough of them. I recently had a kid that had an oxalate level, I think the reference range is under like 400, and she had significant yeast and mold issues. And there's different things you can do to help remove the oxalates, such as Epsom salt baths, of course treating the mold, treating the yeast. So that's a really useful marker too that I like to look at in the context of mycotoxin illness. And then the next one is, can't even see it on here. They're mitochondrial markers, so it's lactic acid and then succinic acid are the next 2. And these are important because mycotoxins can affect the way the mitochondria works. If we scroll down, on the very bottom are neurotransmitters. So they measure 5-HAA, which is for serotonin, quinolonic acid, tryptophan. So you can kind of get a sense of, these people that are dealing with anxiety, if they're lower in serotonin, or they going down the wrong pathway and making quinolonic acid. That's actually serotonin. So serotonin can be high too.
Would SSRIs really mess up that number?
I've seen them a little bit in the high, not super high, but yeah, I'll see them a little bit high. Oh, that's where you were before. No, that was the other one. B6 is very important. It's a cofactor for all sorts of things. It's important for looking at mast cells, which I'll get into in a minute. The bottom yellow area is measuring NAC. Your NAC should be very, very low because you want to be converting to glutathione, so it's a glutathione marker. Important for detoxing mycotoxins. And then at the top is pyroglutamic acid. And you don't want to have that too high. It means they're not converting to glutathione. So this is the total glutathione. It's not looking at reduced and oxidized, but it's a very good marker for glutathione status, all in a urine sample. Medicare covers it. Otherwise, it's $200 prepaid with insurance, except for Aetna and a couple others. And it's $309.
So, another question? Go ahead.
So if you're reaching a real-time lab and
He would. I mean, it depends. And I'm getting more and more. I mean, he's talking me into it.
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, the more information is better. But then the question comes is, do you want your patient to walk out with 6 kits, right? So I kind of do it stepwise. You know, if they come back with a negative mycotoxin test, I might not. We get test fatigue. If they have to do a mycotoxin test, they have to do an IGeneX test. I mean, do I want the OAT test right now, or do I want the OAT test later when I start coming up against walls? Because I know what I'm going to do at the beginning, okay, but I don't know what I'm going to do if they're not getting better. Okay, is that about what you?
Yeah, and this is my favorite test for kids because it's a urine. They're frequently coming to me with like GI issues and behavior issues, and I can just get a ton of information through a urine sample.
I mean, the huge thing on having molds and yeast on that is, I mean, you can just say, oh, we got to give nystatin, or we got to, yeah, and it works.
Yeah.
He taught me that, yeah. A lot of my teachers say that the OAT test is worthless, but I'm finding more and more worth to it. So where am I? We just have to peek here for a second. So we have to check. So if somebody has mold toxin illness, so what happens? Let's go back to your question a little bit. I'm going to take a little sideline. If we do both tests, okay, you don't have to keep doing both tests. If they're both positive, but one's more positive than the other or has worse things, when you follow them later, that's the test you do. Okay? But at the ground floor, you know, having that 7-day challenge and having the same sample urine go is actually a pretty good idea. And if they come back positive, are they still in mold? And if they're still in mold, whether it's in their car or their home or their workplace, you got to get them out of it. So how do you check for mold? And there's different ways to check for mold. And now we're going to bring our mold plates in. Is it
Immunolytics.
So Immunolytics will sell mold plate kits for like $60, but we go one step up. We go to Citrasolve. Mm-hmm. We get the plates that Immunolytics buy, and we can sell 4 plates for like $18. So people, as a screen, can take Petri dishes, which I didn't put in here. I was going to bring them, and they can put them in a room, open them up, and close them, and then incubate them and see if anything grows. If something grows, they have the option to send them to Immunolytics, or to get a mold person to come look at it. I recommend a professional, but so that's the mold plates. We could do, so there's something called ERMI testing. ERMI stands for Environmental Relative Mold Index. It was something that the EPA came up with that kind of does a ratio of non-toxic mold to toxic molds. And this used to be Ritchie Shoemaker's gold standard, but it's expensive. but it kind of tells you how dirty your building is. But some people get really freaked out when their ERMI is high, or the ERMI can have a false negative. But because this is expensive, Richie came up with something called Hurts Me Too. Do you remember what Hurts Me Too stands for? Some of the molds that are in ERMI and does a simpler scoring system, and it misses some of the toxic molds though, and it kind of gives them an idea. It's a cheaper test. The people that we're dealing with, we're on a couple of listservs with mold, with some mycotoxin specialists and some building specialists. They really don't like the ERMI or Hurts Me test anymore. I mean, they think somebody's got to actually look there. For our patients, you can do this on, you can get these and you can send us in a Swiffer towel or something like that, or to an online lab, and you can get the test done. You can do it with real time. And what's the other one? I can get you that information. I'm blanking on the mycometrics. Yeah, you got it. Thank you. And people usually do that without me telling them to, so because they've done a lot of reading. But we tend to like independent environmental engineers, and they're people that look and they know where to look. But they're not foolproof too. And again, when the independent environmental engineers are on our chat rooms, they say, and then I didn't find any mold, and as I was walking out, I just decided to look above the door, and there it was. Anyway, so there's no great way yet. We're working on it.